Hi guys, tonight we begin in a world that feels both familiar and completely unreachable. A world wrapped in deep cold at the edge of the last ice age. You're not in a city, not in a village, but in a vast stretch of quiet land where ice still clings to valleys and wind moves freely across open steppe. Somewhere in this silence, early humans are trying to make sense of a planet that is slowly warming, slowly shifting, and quietly preparing for a change no one can yet understand. You can almost feel the cold air on your skin, thin and dry, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from distant camps. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, if you feel like it. Drop a comment with your location and your local time. It is always interesting to see where in the world this story finds you tonight. Now, dim the lights. You begin to walk forward into this ancient landscape. The ground beneath your feet is firm, slightly frozen, and scattered with pale grasses that bend gently under a weak morning sun. In this time period, which modern scientists often place near the end of the last ice age, human groups are small, mobile, and deeply connected to seasonal rhythms. A mainstream historical fact is that humans at this time were already skilled hunter-gatherers, relying on carefully tracked animal migrations and intimate knowledge of rivers, plants, and weather patterns to survive in environments that could change without warning. You notice how quiet everything feels, not empty, but carefully balanced, as if the world is holding its breath in the distance. A small group of people move slowly across the plain. They wear layered animal hides, stitched together with bone needles and plant fibres. It might surprise you to know that one quirky detail from archaeology is that some of these communities decorated their tools with carved symbols and even used powdered ochre to paint their skin, possibly for ritual, identity, or simply warmth against the cold wind. They do not know it yet. But the world they're walking through is not stable in the way it appears. Glaciers still dominate the north, and meltwater feeds wide rivers that shift their paths over time. Animals migrate in vast herds, and humans follow them like shadows, always moving, always adapting. Everything depends on balance, and balance is something nature rarely keeps for long. You walk closer to their camp. A faint glow of firelight flickers inside a shallow hollow surrounded by stone. The fire is small but carefully tended, surrounded by broken branches and animal bones that have already been stripped of meat. The warmth is precious. It is not just comfort, it is survival itself. You might think of how easy it is today to press a button and have heat, light, and food delivered. But here every flame is earned, guarded, and shared. Inside the group, you notice quiet gestures rather than speech. People point toward the horizon, toward tracks in the soil, toward the direction of wind. Communication is not rushed. It is layered with meaning, built from years of shared experience rather than words alone. Researchers continue to question whether the climate shift approaching this era was gradual and predictable, or whether it arrived in sudden pulses that changed everything within a human lifetime. Some historians still debate whether a rapid cooling event may have been triggered by external forces, while others argue that internal ocean and atmospheric cycles were enough to explain the transformation. You step away from the camp and follow a narrow path along the edge of frozen ground. The air grows slightly colder here, and the landscape opens into a wide, pale expanse. In the distance, faint shapes of large animals move slowly, their bodies heavy and adapted for cold worlds that are already beginning to retreat. A gentle wind passes over the grass, carrying dust and tiny fragments of ice. It brushes against your face like a reminder that this world is always in motion. Even when it feels still, you pause for a moment and listen. There are no engines, no machines, only the soft rhythm of wind and distant movement. The early humans you're walking among do not have a concept of global change. They do not name epochs or measure time in centuries. For them, survival is measured in seasons, in successful hunts, in the return of familiar plants after winter, and yet, beneath that simplicity, something far larger is beginning to unfold. You continue forward, deeper into this ancient moment, unaware that the stability you feel here is only temporary, and that the story of this world is about to shift in ways no one could have imagined. You keep walking through this cold, open landscape, where every step feels like it belongs to a world still learning how to become what it will one day be. The Ice Age is not a single moment in time, but a long, slow rhythm of expansion and retreat. And right now you're standing in one of its final, unstable phases. Glaciers are still vast, but they are no longer fully in control. Meltwater is beginning to carve new paths through stone and soil, quietly reshaping the world beneath your feet. A mainstream historical fact is that during this late Ice Age period, human populations were spread across Eurasia and the Americas in small, mobile groups, constantly adjusting to shifting climates and migrating herds. You can imagine how every valley, every river bend, and every patch of forest mattered deeply. Nothing was permanent, and nothing could be taken for granted. As you move forward, you notice something subtle in the environment. The air feels slightly less harsh than moments before, almost as if the cold itself is hesitating. This is part of what scientists study when they reconstruct ancient climate cycles. Ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica show layers of trapped air that reveal sudden changes in temperature and atmospheric composition. Researchers continue to debate whether these shifts were triggered by ocean circulation changes or by external events that disrupted the balance of the planet. You come across a small encampment, partially sheltered by a curve in the land. Smoke rises slowly from a fire pit, curling upward into the pale sky. People here are not stationary. They move with purpose, packing and unpacking their lives as animals migrate and seasons shift. One quirky detail from archaeological findings is that some groups used portable structures made from wooden frames covered in hides, allowing entire households to be dismantled and rebuilt within hours. You watch as a figure kneels near the fire, carefully turning strips of meat over glowing embers. The smell is faint but noticeable, mixed with smoke and cold earth. Another person nearby sharpens a stone tool against a flat rock, their movements slow and practiced. Everything here is done with intention, because wasted effort could mean hunger in the days ahead. There is a quiet rhythm to this life that feels almost meditative. No clocks, no schedules, only the movement of light and the behavior of animals. And yet, beneath this calm surface, the planet is beginning to shift in ways that no one in this moment can fully understand. Some scholars suggest that late Ice Age communities experienced long periods of stability punctuated by abrupt environmental changes, while others argue that humans adapted so effectively that these changes felt less dramatic at ground level than they appear in geological records. You crouch near the edge of the camp, noticing how carefully everything's arranged. Tools are placed where hands can find them quickly. Bones are stored separately from usable materials. Even firewood is sorted by size. Nothing is random. Everything is survival strategy disguised as habit. A child runs briefly between shelters, laughing softly before being called back by an adult voice. The sound is light, almost surprising in this frozen world. It reminds you that even in extreme environments, human life is not only about survival, but also about connection, play, and repetition of familiar routines. You look toward the horizon again. The sky is pale, almost colourless, but it carries a strange weight, as if something large is moving just beyond perception. Modern scientists would later identify this entire era as a time of major climate instability, where temperatures could shift significantly within decades or even years. You continue along the frozen edge of the land, feeling the uneven texture of ancient soil beneath your steps. The wind picks up slightly, carrying small grains of ice that sting gently against exposed skin. It is not violent, but it is constant. A reminder that this environment does not pause for anyone, and somewhere in this slow, quiet world, the conditions that will lead to a forgotten global disaster are already forming, hidden inside currents of air and ocean that no human here can see. You move deeper into this ancient landscape, where the land is still shaped by the memory of ice even as the great glaciers slowly retreat. The ground is uneven here, marked by long, shallow depressions carved by meltwater and frozen expansion. It is the kind of place where survival depends on reading the smallest details. A broken branch, a set of footprints, a change in wind direction. A mainstream historical fact is that during this late Ice Age world, human groups were highly mobile, often travelling in seasonal cycles that followed herds of reindeer, bison, and mammoth across vast territories. This movement was not random. It was a carefully learned pattern passed down through generations, encoded in memory rather than written record. You notice how the light shifts as clouds drift slowly overhead. The sun is present, but weak, filtered through layers of cold atmosphere. In this era, warmth is not something guaranteed by geography alone. It is something negotiated daily between human effort and natural conditions. Ahead, you see another group of people moving along a ridge. They walk in a loose formation, carrying bundles of tools and hides strapped to their backs. Their pace is steady but cautious, as if every step is part of a larger conversation with the land. One quirky detail that archaeologists have discovered from this period is that some groups use specially shaped bone tools designed not only for hunting, but also for sewing and scraping hides, showing a surprising level of specialization in daily survival tasks. You follow at a distance, careful not to disturb them. The air carries faint sounds now, soft footfalls on frozen ground, the occasional call between individuals, and the low rustle of material shifting as they walk. There is no sense of urgency, but there is constant awareness. In this world, awareness is protection. The terrain begins to slope gently downward, leading toward what once might have been a wider river valley. Now it is partially frozen, a mixture of ice sheets and exposed stone. Water still moves beneath the surface in hidden channels, reshaping the land in slow and invisible ways. Researchers continue to debate whether these late Ice Age environments experience sudden catastrophic disruptions, or whether the changes unfolded in a more gradual but uneven pattern. Some scientists suggest rapid climate pulses, while others point to long-term oscillations in solar and ocean activity. You pause for a moment on a raised patch of ground. From here, you can see far across the landscape. Small fires flicker in distant camps, barely visible points of warmth in a vast cold world. Each one represents a fragile centre of human life, dependent on fuel, shelter, and knowledge passed through generations. You imagine what it must feel like to live with so little certainty. No stored grain for long-term planning, no permanent settlements in most regions, no guarantee that the next season will resemble the last. And yet, there is also rhythm here, a kind of stability found in movement itself. As you continue walking, you notice the air growing slightly heavier, not warmer, but denser, as if something in the atmosphere is shifting. Ice Age climates are known to fluctuate in ways that are not always gradual. Modern ice core data suggests sudden changes that can occur within decades, sometimes even faster. Reshaping ecosystems and human pathways. A small herd of animals appears in the distance. Their forms are large, adapted for cold resistance, moving slowly across the plain. The people you followed earlier begin to angle their movement toward them, not rushing, but adjusting their path with practiced understanding. Hunting is not a single act here. but a coordinated relationship between patience, terrain, and timing. You stay back, watching how each movement is deliberate. Even silence has meaning in this environment. A broken twig could carry consequences. A misplaced step could alter an entire outcome. There is something quietly humbling about this world. It does not respond to human intention. It only responds to adaptation. And as you stand there, observing the slow coordination between humans and land, you begin to sense that this period is not simply a background to history, but a turning point where survival itself is being constantly rewritten by forces far beyond sight. You remain on the edge of this vast Ice Age landscape, where movement is constant even when everything appears still. The people you have been following gradually disappear into the distance, blending into the pale terrain until they're no longer clearly visible. What remains is the open land, the shifting wind, and the quiet sense that this world is always slightly out of balance. A mainstream historical fact is that late Ice Age environments were not uniformly frozen deserts, but complex mosaics of steppe, tundra, forest patches, and glacial margins, all changing over relatively short distances. This meant that human survival depended on extremely detailed environmental knowledge, often learned through lifelong observation. You continue walking alone now, following a faint trail pressed into the frozen soil. The ground here is firmer, almost brittle underfoot, and you can feel the cold seeping upward even through imagined layers of protection. In this world, warmth is not a background condition, it is an achievement. Ahead, the land dips slightly into a shallow valley. You notice remnants of old camps, scattered fragments of bone, broken stone tools, and faint traces of ash absorbed into the earth. One quirky detail that archaeologists often point out is that some Ice Age sites show repeated seasonal return, meaning humans came back to the same locations year after year, even across generations, guided by memory and environmental reliability rather than written maps. You pause near one of these ancient traces. It is almost invisible unless you know what to look for. A darkened patch of soil, slightly different in texture, suggests a fire that once burned here long ago. It is strange to think that entire lives once unfolded in places that now feel like empty silence. The air shifts gently. You notice how the wind moves differently in valleys compared to open plains. It curls, slows, and gathers. In Ice Age climates, such small variations could determine where animals rested, where plants grew, and where humans could safely pause their journeys. Researchers continue to debate whether human groups during this period were primarily driven by environmental pressure, or whether cultural choices played an equally strong role in migration patterns. Some scholars suggest survival dictated every movement, while others argue that tradition and social ties were equally powerful forces shaping mobility. You kneel briefly near the ground, imagining what it would feel like to build a life here, to wake each morning not knowing whether the weather would support travel or force you to stay hidden and still. There is no sense of long-term certainty, only adaptation layered upon adaptation. As you rise again, you notice distant movement on the horizon, not a single group, but several faint shapes moving in parallel paths. Migration routes in this era often overlapped, forming invisible highways across the landscape. These paths were not marked, but remembered collectively by generations of human experience. The sky above begins to shift in tone. A pale grey light spreads slowly, softening edges of the terrain. It is neither storm nor calm, but something in between. A reminder that Ice Age climates were often unstable on timescales that would feel sudden to modern perception. You begin to understand something subtle here. Survival is not just about strength or tools. It is about reading change before it fully arrives. A shift in animal behaviour, a change in wind direction, a slight delay in seasonal patterns. All of these become signs that must be interpreted constantly. One small observation from archaeology adds another layer to this world. Some ancient camps show evidence of carefully organized sleeping areas, suggesting that even in mobile societies, there was structure, familiarity, and shared rhythm within temporary shelters. You continue forward, leaving the old camp traces behind. The landscape opens again, stretching endlessly in muted tones of grey, white, and pale brown. It feels almost endless, but not empty. It is filled with invisible histories, layered one upon another like sediment. And as you walk deeper into this ancient world, you begin to sense that what feels like stillness is actually motion slowed to a scale too large to easily perceive, and that the changes coming to this world are already quietly underway, hidden within the balance of ice, wind, and time. You keep moving through the quiet Ice Age terrain, where the land feels both familiar and strangely uncertain at the same time. The valley behind you slowly disappears from view, replaced by a broader stretch of frozen steppe that seems to extend endlessly in every direction. The wind is steady here, not violent, but persistent, like a presence that never truly leaves. A mainstream historical fact is that Ice Age humans often built temporary shelters using combinations of wood, bone, and animal hides, structures designed to be assembled quickly and moved as needed when resources shifted. These shelters were not simple survival huts, but carefully constructed spaces that balanced warmth, portability, and social living. You begin to notice faint signs of human presence again. A few scattered stones arranged in a loose circle, a darkened patch of soil where fire once burned, and the faintest impression of repeated footsteps pressed into frozen ground. It feels like the memory of a place rather than a place itself. You lower yourself slightly, observing the fire pit more closely, even after thousands of years. The soil still carries a subtle difference in texture. One quirky detail that archaeologists have found in similar sites is that repeated heating of ground surfaces can leave long-lasting chemical traces, allowing researchers to identify ancient camp locations even when no visible structure remains. You imagine the people who once gathered here, not as distant figures of myth, but as real individuals sitting close together for warmth, sharing food, repairing tools, and watching the horizon for signs of movement. Their lives were shaped by constant awareness of scarcity, but also by strong social bonds that made survival possible. The air here feels slightly different. Not warmer, but less sharp. You might think of it as a small pocket of microclimate, shaped by terrain and vegetation, even in Ice Age conditions. Such subtle variations could mean the difference between a livable resting point and an exposed stretch of land. Researchers continue to debate how much Ice Age human survival depended on environmental determinism versus cultural innovation. Some argue that climate forces dictated nearly every aspect of life, while others emphasize the flexibility of human adaptation and the role of shared knowledge in overcoming environmental stress. You stand again and continue forward. The ground becomes more uneven, scattered with small stones and patches of frozen grass. In the distance, low shapes begin to form, possibly more shelters or natural formations that resemble human occupation sites. It is difficult to distinguish at first glance, because in this world, human presence blends seamlessly with nature. As you approach, you notice a faint glow emerging ahead. It is not bright, but it is distinct enough to stand out against the muted tones of the landscape. Firelight, a sign of life. You slow your pace instinctively, as if entering a space that requires respect. Around the fire, several figures sit in a loose circle. Their movements are calm, deliberate. One person is working on a stone tool, another is adjusting a hide covering stretched over a simple frame. The fire itself is small but steady, protected from wind by a low barrier of stones. A mainstream historical fact is that fire was central to Ice Age survival, not only for warmth and cooking, but also for social cohesion, acting as a gathering point where knowledge, stories, and daily plans were shared. Without fire, extended survival in colder regions would have been nearly impossible. You notice something subtle about the group. Their posture is relaxed, but alert. They are not tense, but they are aware. Life in this era demands a constant balance between comfort and readiness. Even moments of rest carry an undercurrent of vigilance. One quirky detail discovered in some prehistoric sites is that traces of pigment, particularly red ochre, are sometimes found near fire areas, suggesting possible ritual use, body decoration, or symbolic marking of space within daily life. The exact meaning is still debated. You remain at a distance, observing quietly. The firelight flickers across faces, creating soft shadows that shift with every movement. There is something deeply human in the scene, something that feels surprisingly modern despite the immense distance in time. Some scholars suggest that Ice Age social groups were more complex and interconnected than previously believed, while others caution that archaeological evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways, and that caution is necessary when reconstructing social behaviour from limited remains. You take a slow step back, careful not to disturb the moment. The wind shifts slightly again, brushing across the open land beyond the camp. Somewhere in that wind is the same force that has shaped glaciers, moved herds, and guided human migration for thousands of years. And as you stand there, you begin to realize that this world is not simply surviving. It is adapting constantly, quietly, and without pause, even in ways that are almost invisible unless you are paying close attention. You linger just beyond the reach of the firelight, careful not to disturb the quiet rhythm of the camp. The people around the fire continue their work as if the world outside this small circle is distant and manageable, even though you already know it is anything but stable. The Ice Age world you're walking through is still in its final long breath. Vast ice sheets remain in the north, but they are thinning, retreating in slow motion across centuries. Meltwater rivers reshape valleys. Wind patterns shift in ways no one can perceive in a single lifetime. This is not a sudden world. It is a world of slow transformations that only become obvious when looking back across thousands of years. One well-established finding in prehistoric archaeology is that Ice Age ecosystems supported a wide range of large mammals, often referred to as megafauna, including mammoths, giant deer, and ancient bison species. These animals were not just background wildlife, they were central to human survival, shaping migration routes, hunting strategies, and even seasonal rhythms. You watch as someone near the fire tightens a cord around a bundle of hides. The motion is practiced and efficient. Every object here has a purpose, and every purpose is tied to survival. Even silence feels structured, like a language without words. A lesser-known detail uncovered at some excavation sites is that Ice Age hunters sometimes followed what researchers call predictive landscapes, meaning they did not simply track animals directly, but read environmental signs like snowdrift patterns, broken vegetation, and distant bird movement to anticipate where herds would appear next. You glance toward the open plains beyond the camp. Somewhere out there, those great herds are still moving, unseen but deeply connected to the survival of everyone here. You begin to understand how fragile this entire system is. If the herds shift too far, too fast, everything else must follow. The fire crackles softly, and for a moment the sound feels almost comforting. Smoke drifts upward and disappears into the pale sky. You notice how the people adjust their positions around the heat, always rotating slightly, always balancing warmth between bodies. Even comfort is distributed carefully. Some researchers propose that Ice Age communities were highly skilled ecological observers, capable of tracking subtle environmental cues that modern humans would likely overlook. Others suggest that survival also involved a degree of chance, where success or failure could depend on unpredictable seasonal fluctuations. You step slightly to the side. Following the edge of the camp's boundary, there are faint marks on the ground here, pressed into the frozen soil, footprints layered over older footprints, suggesting repeated use of this location across time. This place is not a single moment. It is many moments stacked together. A small child briefly appears near the edge of the firelight, then quickly retreats back into the group. The movement is brief, almost fleeting, but it reminds you that life here is not only about endurance, it is also about continuity, about passing time through generations in environments that rarely remain stable. You notice how carefully everything is arranged. Sleeping areas are positioned away from wind exposure. Tools are grouped by function. Food remnants are stored or discarded in specific patterns. Nothing is random. Every arrangement reflects accumulated knowledge. Far beyond the camp, the land begins to shift again into wider openness. The horizon feels distant, almost unreachable, as if the world itself expands the further you look. Ice Age geography often created these vast visual scales, where human presence felt small but not insignificant. You think about how different this is from the modern world, where environments are often controlled, regulated, and enclosed. Here, everything is open, and everything requires constant negotiation with natural forces. The fire behind you continues to burn steadily, a small anchor of warmth in an enormous landscape of cold, and as you stand there, you begin to sense that this stability is temporary, always temporary, because the forces shaping this world are never still, even when they appear calm. You leave the firelit camp behind, and the warmth slowly fades from your skin as you step back into the open Ice Age landscape. The transition is immediate, almost sharp, as if you have crossed an invisible boundary between safety and exposure. Ahead of you, the land stretches into a wide, pale expanse shaped by wind, cold, and long-forgotten seasons. The Ice Age world at this time is not a uniform sheet of ice, but a complex environment of shifting tundra, steppe grasslands, and glacial edges. One widely accepted understanding in prehistoric studies is that these mixed environments allowed both large herbivores and human groups to spread across enormous territories, creating interconnected survival networks across continents. You walk slowly along a faint ridge where the ground rises slightly above the surrounding plain. The wind is stronger here, brushing across your face with a dry, constant pressure. It carries no scent of civilization, only the cold trace of earth and distant snowfields. As you continue, you notice subtle changes in the sky. The light is still pale, but it has a different quality now, slightly muted, as if filtered through layers of thin cloud. Ice core records suggest that this period was marked by frequent atmospheric shifts, where temperature and moisture levels could fluctuate within relatively short spans of time. A small observation from archaeological research shows that Ice Age communities often adjusted their travel routes based on seasonal wind direction, using it not only as a comfort factor, but also as a guide for predicting weather changes and animal movement patterns. You pause briefly and look across the horizon. The vast openness gives a strange sense of scale, as if the world has been stretched further than it should be. In the distance, faint shapes move across the plain, too far to clearly identify. They could be herds, or simply shifting shadows of terrain. There is a quiet tension in this landscape, not fear, but awareness. Everything depends on reading what is almost invisible, a change in snow texture, a slight delay in seasonal thaw, a subtle shift in animal migration timing. Survival here is built on noticing what most would miss, Some scholars propose that Ice Age humans developed highly refined tracking skills that combined observation, memory, and environmental intuition. Others argue that much of this knowledge was shared collectively within groups rather than held by individuals, making survival a deeply social process. You continue forward and notice shallow depressions in the ground, partially filled with wind-blown sediment. These might once have been travel routes or temporary resting points. Over time, even human movement becomes part of the landscape itself, slowly absorbed and reshaped by natural forces. The air grows slightly heavier again, not warmer, but more still. It feels as if the wind is pausing between movements in Ice Age climates. Such subtle shifts often preceded larger changes in weather patterns, though no one in this time would recognize them as warnings in the modern sense. A quiet thought arises as you walk. Life here is not structured around control, but around response. There is no attempt to dominate the environment, only to move with it, to adjust constantly, to survive within its rhythms. You think again about the camp you left behind, the fire, the tools, the quiet coordination of people working together in silence. It all feels distant now, like a brief pocket of stability in an otherwise fluid world. One lesser-known detail from archaeological findings is that some Ice Age sites show evidence of repeated seasonal revisits separated by long gaps of time, suggesting that certain locations held long-term memory value for human groups even across generations. As you walk further, the horizon begins to shift slightly, not dramatically, but enough to suggest a change in terrain ahead. The land may be opening into a wider valley or narrowing into a corridor shaped by ancient water flow, and as you move into this uncertain distance, you begin to understand something quietly profound about this world. Nothing here is fixed, not the land, not the climate, not even the paths that humans follow. Everything is in motion, even when it appears still. You continue along the faint ridge, where the Ice Age wind never truly stops, only changes its tone. It moves across the land in long, low waves, brushing over frozen grass and exposed stone, shaping everything it touches without ever being seen. The camp you left behind is now fully gone from sight, replaced by open distance and a silence that feels much larger than before. The late Ice Age period you're moving through is often described by researchers as a time of environmental instability layered over long stretches of adaptation. Glaciers still existed, but they were no longer advancing in a single direction. Instead, they pulsed, retreated, and reformed in response to shifting global temperatures and ocean currents. You step down gently from the ridge into a shallow depression. The ground here is softer, covered with thin layers of frost and compacted soil. Each step leaves a faint impression before the cold slowly begins to erase it again. It is a reminder that in this world, traces do not last long. A widely accepted archaeological interpretation is that many Ice Age groups relied heavily on mobility corridors, natural pathways shaped by terrain, water sources, and animal movement. These routes were not mapped in any formal sense, but they were remembered through experience and passed along through shared knowledge within groups. As you move through this depression, you notice scattered stones arranged in irregular clusters. They are not clearly artificial at first glance, but something about their placement feels intentional. Perhaps they once marked a temporary resting point, or perhaps they are simply natural formations that humans later adapted into their routines. A lesser-known detail from excavation studies is that some ancient camps show repeated use of the same microlocations within a landscape, even when better resources were available elsewhere, suggesting that familiarity and memory often influenced movement as much as immediate survival needs. You pause briefly, listening. The wind is quieter here, partially blocked by the surrounding terrain. In this stillness, you become more aware of subtle sounds, the distant crack of shifting ice, the faint rustle of dry vegetation, and the almost imperceptible movement of small animals hidden in the grass. Some researchers continue to debate whether Ice Age humans experience their environment primarily as a landscape of risk or as a structured system of known and predictable patterns. One perspective emphasizes constant uncertainty, while another highlights deep ecological familiarity that reduced unpredictability over time. You kneel slightly and touch the ground. It is cold, firm, and layered with time. Beneath the surface, frozen moisture binds everything together, preserving traces of past seasons in ways that modern humans rarely encounter directly. Ahead, the depression begins to rise again into open land. The horizon stretches wide, uninterrupted, with only faint undulations in the terrain. It feels both empty and full at the same time, as if the land is holding countless invisible stories beneath its surface. You notice how your sense of direction begins to rely less on landmarks and more on subtle environmental cues. The slope of the ground, the angle of wind, the distribution of vegetation. In a world like this, orientation is not fixed, it is constantly reconstructed. A small observation from prehistoric studies shows that Ice Age humans often developed deep familiarity with specific regions, sometimes covering vast distances but always returning to known zones, creating what researchers describe as lived maps embedded in memory rather than drawn on surfaces. You continue forward, and the light begins to shift again, not dramatically, but enough to signal the slow passage of time. The sky remains pale, but the tone deepens slightly, hinting that the day is moving forward without urgency. And as you walk deeper into this open Ice Age world, you begin to sense something subtle but important. The disaster that will one day reshape this entire era is not a single moment waiting in the future. It is already forming quietly, layer by layer, within the same systems of ice, wind, and water that surround you now. You move further away from the ridge and into a broader stretch of Ice Age terrain, where the land flattens and opens like an endless, pale sea of frozen grass and compacted earth. The wind here feels less obstructed, flowing freely across the surface of the world, carrying with it a sense of distance that is difficult to measure. The late Ice Age environment you're walking through is often described in paleoclimate studies as highly dynamic, with rapid shifts in temperature and precipitation patterns occurring over relatively short geological periods. These fluctuations did not happen evenly across the planet, creating a patchwork of conditions that shaped human movement in complex ways. You notice that the ground becomes slightly more textured as you walk. Small ridges form where wind has sculpted the soil over time. Between them, thin layers of frost still cling to shaded areas. Each detail feels subtle, but together they create a landscape that is constantly being rewritten. A well-documented aspect of prehistoric life is that human groups during this period often organized their movement around water sources, particularly meltwater streams and seasonal rivers that shifted their courses as glaciers advanced and retreated. These water systems acted as both lifelines and navigation guides. You come across a shallow stream cutting through the land. It moves slowly, partially frozen along its edges, with dark water visible beneath a thin layer of ice. The sound is faint but steady, a quiet reminder that even in this cold world, movement continues beneath the surface. One lesser-known archaeological detail is that some Ice Age sites show evidence of fishing tools and nets, suggesting that aquatic resources played a more significant role in survival than early researchers once assumed. This adds another layer to how adaptable these communities truly were. You kneel near the stream, observing the water as it flows beneath its frozen shell. It feels almost paradoxical. Motion trapped inside stillness, in many ways. This reflects the broader Ice Age environment itself, where change is always happening, but often hidden beneath surface calm. Some scholars continue to debate whether Ice Age humans were primarily constrained by environmental pressures, or whether they actively shaped their ecosystems through hunting patterns and selective resource use. The truth likely lies somewhere between these interpretations. You rise again and continue along the edge of the stream. The land here is slightly more vegetated, with patches of hardy grasses and low shrubs that survive despite the cold. These small pockets of life create subtle contrasts in an otherwise muted world. In the distance, you notice movement again. Not large herds this time, but smaller clusters of animals shifting between feeding grounds. Their behavior is cautious, always responsive to environmental cues that humans also depend on. You begin to understand how deeply interconnected everything is in this world. Water, animals, terrain, and human movement form a single system, each element influencing the others in ways that are continuous and inseparable. A common interpretation among researchers is that Ice Age survival depended not only on physical endurance, but also on cognitive mapping of seasonal cycles, allowing humans to anticipate changes rather than simply react to them. As you walk, the stream gradually widens before disappearing into a low marshy area. The ground becomes softer, and your steps feel less stable. Here, the land is transitioning again, shifting between frozen solidity and seasonal thaw. You pause for a moment and look back. The path you've taken is already becoming less distinct, slowly softened by wind and time. In this environment, even recent movement begins to fade almost immediately, and as you face forward again, you realize that this world is not defined by stability or chaos, but by constant transformation, where every element is quietly adjusting to forces that are larger than any single moment in time. You leave the shallow stream behind, and the land begins to change in subtle but noticeable ways. The frozen grass gives way to uneven patches of damp soil, where the surface feels less stable beneath your steps. Every movement requires more attention now, as if the ground itself is slowly becoming uncertain. The late Ice Age period you're moving through is often characterized in scientific literature as a time of strong environmental gradients, where small geographic shifts could produce very different local climates. This meant that human groups often experienced dramatically different conditions within relatively short travel distances. You continue forward, and the air feels slightly heavier here, not warmer in any comfortable sense, but denser, as if moisture is accumulating somewhere beyond sight. Ice Age ecosystems were deeply sensitive to such changes, with even minor shifts in humidity influencing plant growth and animal behavior. A widely observed archaeological pattern is that human groups in this era often established semi-seasonal camps near transitional environments, such as the edges between forest and open steppe. These zones provided access to multiple resource types, increasing survival flexibility. You notice the first hints of such a transition ahead. Sparse clusters of low trees begin to appear, their branches thin and resilient, shaped by cold winds and limited sunlight. The landscape is no longer fully open, but not yet enclosed. It exists in between. One lesser-known detail from excavation studies is that tree ring analysis from this period reveals irregular growth patterns, suggesting sudden climate fluctuations that affected vegetation cycles in unpredictable ways. These fluctuations would have directly influenced the availability of food and shelter materials. You walk carefully between the first scattered trees. The wind here behaves differently. It breaks and shifts around obstacles, creating quieter pockets of air followed by sudden gusts. The sound of the environment changes accordingly, becoming more layered and less uniform. Some researchers continue to debate whether these transitional Ice Age zones acted as refuges for human populations, or whether they were unstable regions that required constant movement to remain viable. Evidence appears to support both interpretations depending on location and time period. You notice faint traces on the ground again, not clear footprints, but compressed patches of earth that suggest repeated passage. These may indicate seasonal movement routes connecting open plains with more sheltered woodland areas. As you move deeper into this mixed landscape, the light begins to shift again. The presence of trees filters the pale sunlight, creating soft patterns across the ground. It feels less exposed, but also more complex, as if the world has gained additional layers of texture. A common interpretation among paleoanthropologists is that human survival during the late Ice Age was closely tied to ecological flexibility, with groups adapting not only to climate change but also to rapidly shifting local ecosystems. You pass a fallen tree trunk, partially buried in frost. Its surface is rough and weathered, shaped by years of exposure. Small marks on the wood suggest possible tool use, though time has softened their clarity. The deeper you go into this transitional zone, the more you feel how layered this environment truly is. It is not a single ecosystem, but a blending of many, constantly reshaping boundaries between forest, steppe, water, and ice. You pause briefly, listening. The sounds here are different from the open plains. There is rustling, distant movement, and the faint creak of branches responding to wind. It feels more enclosed, yet still open enough to remain unpredictable. And as you continue forward, you begin to sense that this shifting landscape is not just a background to human survival, but an active force shaping every decision, every migration, and every fragile moment of stability in this ancient world. You move deeper into the transitional forest zone, where the Ice Age landscape begins to feel more enclosed, as if the world itself is slowly narrowing around your path. The open plains are now behind you, replaced by scattered trees, uneven ground, and a quieter, more layered atmosphere. The wind still exists here, but it no longer moves freely. It breaks, softens, and reappears in shifting patterns between trunks and branches. The late Ice Age period is widely understood by researchers as a time when human populations experienced significant regional contraction and expansion, depending on how quickly environment shifted. In some areas, groups thrived in resource-rich corridors, while in others, survival became increasingly difficult as ecosystems changed. You step carefully over a patch of exposed roots. The ground here is less predictable, alternating between frozen firmness and soft, damp soil. Each step feels slightly more deliberate, as if the land is asking for attention in exchange for passage. A well-documented insight from archaeological research is that Ice Age forests often served as seasonal refuges for both animals and humans, offering shelter from harsh winds and access to diverse food sources such as berries, small game, and edible plants that were unavailable on open steppe. You notice how sound behaves differently here. Instead of carrying far across open distance, it is absorbed and scattered. A distant movement becomes harder to trace. Even your own footsteps feel quieter, softened by layers of vegetation and cold air. One lesser-known observation from excavation sites is that certain forest-edge settlements show repeated short-term occupation rather than long continuous habitation, suggesting a rhythm of return and departure tied closely to seasonal cycles. You pause near a cluster of thin trees. Their bark is rough and pale, marked by wind exposure and cold stress. Small patches of frost cling to shaded areas where sunlight rarely reaches. It is a fragile kind of stability, one that depends entirely on balance between cold and life. Some researchers continue to explore whether Ice Age human groups in forested zones developed more localized knowledge systems compared to their counterparts on open plains, while others suggest mobility remained equally important across all environments. You notice faint signs of animal activity here, broken twigs, shallow impressions in soft ground, and scattered remains of plant material suggest recent movement. Life is present, but not immediately visible. You continue forward. Following a narrow natural corridor between trees, the path is not clearly defined, but it feels subtly reinforced by repeated use over time in environments like this. Movement itself shapes geography. A widely accepted interpretation in paleoecology is that edge environments between forest and open steppe often produce the highest biodiversity, making them especially important for both human survival and animal migration patterns. As you walk, the light changes again. It becomes softer, filtered through branches above. Shadows shift slowly across the ground, creating a calm, almost rhythmic pattern that contrasts with the harsh openness of the plains you left behind. You begin to sense how different survival must feel here, less exposed, but more visually complex, less wind-driven, but more enclosed. Every environment offers both protection and constraint, and as you move further into this forested world, you realize that nothing in this Ice Age landscape exists in isolation. Every change in temperature, vegetation, or movement ripples outward, shaping the fragile balance that both humans and animals depend on without ever fully controlling. You continue deeper into the forest edge, where the Ice Age world feels increasingly layered and enclosed, as if each step takes you further into a quieter, older version of the planet. The trees here are not dense like modern forests you might imagine, but scattered and resilient, shaped by cold winds and long seasonal stress. Their presence changes everything, from how light moves to how silence behaves. A widely established finding in prehistoric ecology is that late Ice Age forest margins often acted as dynamic transition zones, where ecosystems overlapped and shifted in response to rapid climate oscillations. These zones were neither fully stable nor fully chaotic, but constantly adjusting. You step over a fallen branch covered in frost. It cracks softly beneath your weight, the sound briefly breaking the calm atmosphere before dissolving into the surrounding stillness. The ground is uneven, shaped by roots, frozen soil, and old traces of water flow that once moved freely here. A lesser-known detail from archaeological research is that some Ice Age forest sites contain evidence of small, semi-permanent tool repair areas, suggesting that humans repeatedly return to specific sheltered spots, not just for survival, but also for maintenance and preparation. You notice how your perception of distance changes in this environment. In the open plains, everything stretched far and wide. Here, space feels compressed. Objects appear closer, even when they are not. Sound is harder to track, and movement becomes more hidden. The Ice Age climate during this period is often reconstructed through layered evidence from ice cores, pollen records, and sediment analysis. These sources suggest a world where temperature shifts could occur in cycles, influencing vegetation growth and animal distribution in ways that were not always predictable on a human timescale. You pause near a small clearing where light breaks through the canopy. The brightness feels sudden after the filtered dimness of the trees in the center of the clearing. You notice disturbed soil, possibly the remnants of an old resting site or temporary shelter. Some researchers propose that Ice Age humans developed strong spatial memory tied to such clearings, using them as navigation points within otherwise complex and visually obstructed landscapes. Others suggest these spaces held social or symbolic importance in addition to practical use. You crouch slightly and examine the ground. There are faint impressions, almost erased by time. It is difficult to tell how old they are, but their presence suggests repeated human passage, even when people are gone. Their movement leaves patterns that the land slowly absorbs. You stand again and continue forward. The forest begins to thin slightly ahead, where trees grow farther apart and the ground becomes more open. The wind returns in soft intervals, moving between branches and carrying with it the distant feeling of open space beyond the trees. A well-documented pattern in Ice Age archaeology is that human groups often transitioned between forested and open environments depending on seasonal pressure, creating flexible movement systems rather than fixed territorial boundaries. You begin to notice more animal signs now, trampled vegetation, faint trails, and occasional broken branches suggest that larger creatures have passed through recently. Yet nothing is visible, only traces of presence. The light shifts again, slowly deepening in tone as the day continues. Shadows lengthen across the uneven ground, and the forest begins to feel slightly more subdued, as if preparing for transition into evening. You move carefully, aware that every environment here carries its own rhythm. In the open plains, survival depended on distance and vision. In the forest, it depends on awareness and interpretation of subtle signs. And as you walk through this shifting landscape, you begin to understand that the Ice Age world is not divided into separate ecosystems, but exists as a continuous gradient of change, where every step moves you into a slightly different version of the same fragile planet. You leave the thicker part of the forest behind, and the landscape gradually opens again, but not into the wide emptiness of the plains you saw earlier. Instead, you enter a mixed environment where trees, shrubs, and open ground coexist in uneven balance. It feels like a world that has not yet decided what it wants to become. A widely accepted interpretation in Ice Age studies is that these mosaic landscapes, formed by shifting climate zones, created some of the most resource-rich environments for human groups, offering access to both forest resources and open land game within a relatively small area. You walk slowly across this uneven terrain. The ground alternates between firm patches of frozen soil and softer areas where moisture is gathered. Each step requires adjustment, as if the land itself is constantly reminding you that stability here is temporary. A lesser-known detail from excavation evidence is that some late Ice Age sites show overlapping occupation layers, suggesting that different human groups may have used the same locations at different times, sometimes separated by long intervals, creating a kind of repeated human memory embedded in place. You notice how the vegetation changes subtly as you move. Some plants are low and hardy, surviving in cold, exposed areas, while others cluster near sheltered patches where wind is reduced. This variation creates a textured landscape of survival strategies, not just for humans, but for all living things here. The climate context of this period is often reconstructed as highly sensitive to ocean circulation patterns, which influence temperature distribution across continents. Small shifts in these systems could lead to significant regional changes in vegetation and animal movement. You pause near a shallow depression filled with frost and scattered stones. The arrangement feels almost intentional, though it may simply be the result of natural processes in Ice Age environments. It is often difficult to distinguish between human influence and environmental shaping. Some researchers suggest that human perception of landscape during this era was deeply relational, meaning places were understood not as static locations, but as dynamic interactions between resources, memory, and seasonal timing. Others argue that such interpretations risk projecting modern thinking onto ancient cognition. You continue forward and notice the air becoming slightly more open again. The wind flows more freely through this space, carrying with it the faint sound of distant movement. It could be animals, or simply the shifting terrain responding to air currents. A well-documented aspect of prehistoric mobility is that human groups often followed ecological gradients rather than fixed paths, adjusting their routes based on resource availability rather than strict territorial boundaries. You begin to see faint tracks ahead, partially softened by time and wind. They are not clear enough to follow precisely, but they suggest that both humans and animals have moved through this corridor recently. The land here is not empty, only layered with passage. As you walk, the light becomes warmer in tone, though still filtered through cold air. It creates a soft contrast across the ground, highlighting uneven textures and subtle changes in elevation. You think about how different survival feels in this kind of environment. Not constant exposure like the open plains, not full enclosure like the deep forest, but a continuous negotiation between both. Every step is an adjustment to shifting conditions. One lesser-known archaeological observation is that transitional zones like this often show the greatest diversity of tool types, suggesting that humans adapted their material culture specifically to mixed environments. You move further into the open, where the trees thin even more and the horizon begins to reappear. The sense of scale slowly returns, expanding outward after the enclosed forest sections, and as you continue, you realize that this Ice Age world is not a sequence of separate places, but a continuous field of change, where forest, steppe, water, and ice blend into one another without clear boundaries, shaping every decision made by those who live within it. You step fully out of the mixed woodland corridor, and the world opens again in a slow, quiet reveal. The Ice Age landscape stretches outward in layered tones of pale grass, scattered shrubs, and distant low hills shaped by ancient glaciers. It feels broader again, but not empty. Instead, it feels like a space that is constantly remembering what it used to be. A widely established conclusion in quaternary science is that this late Ice Age world was shaped by repeated abrupt climate oscillations, including one major reversal event known for rapidly returning cold conditions after a period of warming. These shifts were powerful enough to reorganize ecosystems across entire continents. You walk forward into this open terrain, where the wind becomes more direct again. It moves across your body without obstruction, carrying fine particles of frost that dissolve almost immediately upon contact. This sensation is subtle, but constant, like the land is gently pressing its presence into you. A lesser-known detail from archaeological records is that some human groups appear to have adjusted their seasonal migrations in response to rapid environmental fluctuations, sometimes reversing traditional routes within a single generation when conditions changed unexpectedly. You notice how the ground changes underfoot. It becomes firmer, more consistent, less interrupted by roots or dense vegetation. This openness allows for clearer visibility across long distances, and your gaze naturally drifts toward the horizon where faint shapes rise and fall with the terrain. In Ice Age environments like this, researchers often emphasize the importance of ecological thresholds, points where small changes in temperature or moisture could cause large shifts in vegetation zones and animal populations. These thresholds were not predictable in a modern sense, but they shaped everything. You pause briefly on a slight rise in the land. From here, the world feels expanded again. You can see distant patches of darker vegetation, possibly indicating wetter soil or sheltered microclimates. Somewhere beyond that, the land fades into a soft haze. A well-studied observation in paleoanthropology is that human groups during this period often developed flexible social structures that could expand or contract depending on resource availability, allowing them to maintain cohesion even under environmental stress. You continue walking, and the wind shifts slightly in direction. It carries a colder edge now, a reminder that Ice Age climates rarely maintain consistency for long, even within a single day. Conditions could change enough to alter travel decisions. You notice faint traces again on the ground, not deep impressions, but subtle disturbances in the grass and soil. They suggest passage, but not permanence, in this world. Nothing truly stays fixed in place for long. Some researchers continue to debate how sudden the major climate shifts of this era actually were. Ice core data suggests abrupt transitions in atmospheric conditions, while other interpretations argue for more gradual regional variability depending on geography. You move further into the open, where the horizon becomes more defined. The sense of scale returns again, stretching far beyond immediate perception. It is the kind of space that makes human presence feel both significant and small at the same time. A lesser-known archaeological insight is that certain late Ice Age toolkits show rapid adaptation in design complexity, suggesting that technological change could occur quickly in response to environmental pressure. You think about how survival here is never static. It is not a fixed skill set, but a continuous adjustment. Every generation inherits not just tools, but the memory of how to respond to uncertainty. The wind strengthens slightly again, moving across the grass in visible waves. It is almost hypnotic in its consistency, as if the entire landscape is breathing in slow motion. And as you continue forward, you begin to understand something fundamental about this Ice Age world. It is not defined by stability or disaster alone, but by constant recalibration, where even small shifts in climate ripple outward into every aspect of life, reshaping the fragile balance between survival and collapse. You continue across the open Ice Age steppe, where the land feels stretched under a pale, shifting sky. The terrain is gently rolling now, with low rises and shallow dips that guide your movement without ever fully directing it. There is no clear path, only patterns that suggest where others might have walked before you. A widely recognised finding in quaternary climate research is that ocean circulation played a crucial role in regulating Ice Age temperatures, redistributing heat across hemispheres and influencing precipitation patterns on a global scale. Even small disruptions in these systems could create cascading environmental effects. You walk slowly, noticing how the grass bends in waves as wind passes through it. It is a subtle motion, but constant, giving the landscape a sense of quiet breathing. The cold is still present, but it no longer feels sharp. Instead, it feels like a long background condition that never fully disappears. A lesser-known detail from paleoenvironmental studies is that pollen analysis from sediment layers shows rapid shifts in vegetation types during this period, indicating that plant communities could reorganize themselves within relatively short ecological timescales. You pause briefly and scan the horizon. The open distance makes everything feel both visible and uncertain. Shapes appear far away, but details remain unclear. In environments like this, perception becomes a negotiation between what is seen and what is assumed. Some researchers emphasize that Ice Age humans likely developed strong anticipatory skills, not only reacting to environmental change but predicting it through long observation of seasonal patterns, animal movement, and subtle atmospheric cues. You continue forward, stepping over uneven ground where frost has formed thin crusts over soil. Each step produces a faint crunch that disappears almost instantly into the wind. The sound feels small in such a large landscape. Ahead, you notice darker patches of vegetation. These areas suggest slightly more moisture or protection from wind, creating micro pockets where life can persist more easily. An Ice Age ecosystems. Such small variations often determined entire movement routes for both animals and humans. A widely discussed interpretation in archaeology is that mobility was not random during this period, but structured around predictable environmental gradients, allowing groups to maximize access to seasonal resources while minimizing exposure to risk. You begin to sense a subtle shift in the air again, not dramatic, but noticeable. The wind carries a slightly different tone, and the sky appears a shade more muted. These changes are often the first indicators of larger atmospheric transitions in glacial climates. You walk through a shallow depression where the soil feels softer underfoot. Here, traces of past movement are more visible. Flattened grass, faint impressions, and scattered fragments of organic material suggest repeated passage over time. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some Ice Age sites show evidence of short-term camps used repeatedly over centuries. indicating that memory of place could persist even when physical markers had nearly disappeared. You continue onward, and the landscape begins to feel more expansive again. The horizon stretches further, and the sense of enclosure fades. It is as if the world is opening itself back up after a period of narrowing. You think about how survival in this environment depends on constant awareness, not just of immediate threats, but of gradual changes that unfold slowly enough to be missed if not carefully observed. Some researchers continue to debate whether Ice Age populations experienced environmental stress as a series of sharp crises or as a continuous background of adaptation punctuated by occasional abrupt shifts. Both interpretations find support in different regions of evidence. The wind strengthens slightly again, moving across the grass in long, uninterrupted currents. It shapes the landscape in visible ways, bending vegetation and smoothing patterns in the soil. And as you move deeper into this open Ice Age world, you begin to understand that nothing here is ever fully stable. The land, the climate, and the life it supports are all part of a system that is constantly adjusting, quietly preparing for changes that will one day reshape everything. You move across the open steppe, where the Ice Age wind stretches endlessly without obstruction, shaping both sound and silence in equal measure. The land feels larger here, not because it has changed, but because there is nothing to contain your perception of it. Every direction looks the same at first glance, yet every detail carries subtle variation. One well-established conclusion from ice core analysis is that this period contained multiple rapid climate oscillations, where temperature and atmospheric composition shifted in relatively short geological intervals. These changes were recorded in layers of trapped air, preserved like a slow archive of the planet's breathing. You walk forward, feeling the ground firm beneath your steps. The soil here is compacted, mixed with frost and fine gravel shaped by ancient glacial retreat. Each step leaves only a faint mark before wind begins to soften it again. Nothing remains clearly defined for long in this environment. A lesser-known finding from archaeological excavations is that some Ice Age camps show evidence of specialized task zones, where different activities such as tool-making, food preparation, and hide processing were consistently separated within living spaces. You notice how the sky feels slightly different now. The brightness is still pale, but the tone has shifted subtly, as if a thin layer of cloud is filtering the light from above. These atmospheric changes are often linked in climate research to shifts in ocean circulation patterns that influence weather stability across entire regions. You pause briefly and look across the horizon. The distance is vast, but not empty. Faint variations in colour suggest low vegetation clusters or uneven terrain. In Ice Age landscapes, what appears uniform at first often reveals complexity upon closer observation. Some interpretations in paleoanthropology suggest that human survival during this period depended heavily on the ability to read multi-layered environmental signals, combining visual cues, sound patterns, and seasonal memory into adaptive decision-making. You continue walking, and the wind shifts direction slightly. It is a small change, but noticeable. The grass responds in waves, bending and recovering in slow motion. The entire landscape seems to move as a single system rather than isolated parts. A well-documented pattern in prehistoric settlement studies is that human groups frequently positioned camps near ecological intersections, where multiple resource zones overlapped, increasing both efficiency and flexibility in resource gathering. You pass over a shallow ridge where the ground rises gently. From here, you can see further into the distance again. The openness returns, but it feels different than before, as if the land has subtly reorganized itself. You notice faint disturbances in the soil, not clearly human, not clearly animal, but suggestive of repeated movement. In Ice Age environments, ambiguity is common, as natural processes often mimic signs of habitation. A lesser-known detail from sediment analysis is that wind-driven deposition in this era could rapidly obscure surface traces, meaning that archaeological visibility is often shaped more by preservation conditions than actual human activity density. You continue forward, and the light begins to soften again. It is not a dramatic shift, but a gradual deepening of tone that suggests the day is moving forward without urgency or pause. You begin to understand that this landscape is not defined by clear boundaries or stable zones, but by gradients of change that overlap and blend into one another continuously. Some researchers emphasize that Ice Age environments should be understood as dynamic systems rather than static backgrounds, where ecological and climatic forces interact in constantly shifting configurations. And as you walk further into this vast open world, you begin to sense that every step you take is part of a much larger pattern, one that stretches far beyond individual perception, quietly shaping the future of everything that will one day emerge from this fragile, changing planet. You continue across the open Ice Age landscape, where the horizon feels both close and unreachable at the same time. The ground is steady here, but never truly still. Small shifts in soil, grass, and frost reveal a world that is constantly adjusting itself in ways too slow to notice in any single moment. A widely supported finding in paleoclimate research is that late Ice Age environments experienced repeated abrupt warming and cooling phases, often referred to as climate oscillations, which influenced vegetation zones, animal migration, and human settlement patterns across vast regions. You walk forward, feeling the wind now coming slightly from your left side. It is subtle, but it changes how the grass moves, creating diagonal waves that ripple across the steppe. In this kind of environment, even the wind becomes a kind of map, always offering clues about distance, terrain, and weather. A lesser-known archaeological observation is that some Ice Age sites contain evidence of temporary microcamps, very short-term stopping points used during migration routes, often leaving only faint traces of fire use and broken tools behind. You notice a slight depression in the ground ahead, where frost has gathered more densely. The temperature here feels marginally lower, not enough to be dramatic, but enough to influence how moisture settles into the soil. In many environmental reconstructions, this era is described as a period where ecosystems were highly responsive to small climatic triggers. A minor shift in temperature or precipitation could cause noticeable changes in vegetation coverage within a few seasons. You slow your pace slightly as the terrain becomes more uneven again. The openness of the steppe begins to break into subtle variations, small rises and dips that shape how far you can see in any direction. Some researchers suggest that human cognition during this period was strongly shaped by constant environmental reading, where survival depended on interpreting patterns in animal movement, plant distribution, and atmospheric behavior almost continuously. You pass near a cluster of taller grasses, their stems dry and stiff. They rustle softly as the wind moves through them, producing a sound that is faint but steady, almost like distant breathing. A well-documented detail from excavation sites is that tool assemblages from this era often show rapid adaptation in design, suggesting that technological innovation could respond quickly to environmental stress and resource availability. You glance toward the horizon again. The sky has not changed dramatically, but its tone feels slightly heavier, as if moisture is building somewhere far beyond what you can see. You continue walking, noticing how your awareness of space shifts over time. Distances feel both vast and compressed depending on how the terrain opens or closes around you. Some interpretations in prehistoric studies emphasize that Ice Age survival was not purely reactive but involved long-term planning based on seasonal anticipation, even without written systems or formal record-keeping. You cross another subtle rise in the land, and from here the view expands once more. The world opens outward in muted tones, with no sharp edges, only gradual transitions between earth, sky, and vegetation. A lesser-known insight from sediment records is that wind patterns during this period were not only strong but highly variable, capable of change in direction frequently within short time spans, reshaping surface conditions continuously. You feel that variability now, even if only in a small way. The air never settles into one consistent form. It always shifts, always adjusts, always reminds you that stability here is temporary. And as you move deeper into this Ice Age world, you begin to understand that survival is not anchored in place, but in awareness, in the ability to read a landscape that is never finished, never fixed, and always quietly becoming something else. You continue across the open steppe, where the Ice Age world stretches in quiet layers of pale grass, frozen soil, and distant haze. The land feels expansive again, but not empty. Instead, it feels inhabited by traces, invisible paths, and long dissolved movements that still shape the way the terrain behaves. A widely accepted interpretation in quaternary science is that this late Ice Age period was marked by large-scale climate instability, including abrupt transitions between colder and warmer phases that affected ecosystems across continents in relatively short timeframes. You walk slowly, noticing how the ground changes in texture beneath your steps. Some areas are firm and dry, while others feel slightly softer, as if moisture has recently shifted beneath the surface. Even these small differences influence how life can persist here. A lesser-known detail from archaeological surveys is that some Ice Age regions contain overlapping layers of habitation, separated by long periods of abandonment, suggesting that human groups repeatedly returned to familiar landscapes after environmental conditions improved. You glance toward the horizon. The sky is pale but textured, with faint gradients that suggest distant weather systems moving slowly across the atmosphere. Nothing feels fixed. Everything feels in motion, even when it appears calm. In climate reconstruction studies, this era is often described as a time when atmospheric circulation patterns played a dominant role in shaping regional climates, creating strong contrast between areas that were geographically close but environmentally different. You continue forward, passing through patches of taller grass that bend gently under the wind. The sound is soft and continuous, almost like a low whisper spreading across the land. It is the only consistent rhythm in an otherwise shifting environment. Some researchers continue to explore whether Ice Age human populations experienced environmental change as a series of abrupt disruptions, or as a continuous flow of gradual adjustments punctuated by sharper transitions. You notice faint disturbances in the soil again, not clearly defined footprints, but subtle compressions that suggest repeated passage. In this world, even uncertainty can carry meaning, as natural processes often blur the boundaries between human and non-human traces. A well-documented observation from prehistoric tool analysis is that late Ice Age technologies often show regional variation that reflects both environmental adaptation and cultural transmission between groups across wide distances. You move past a shallow depression where frost collects more heavily. The temperature feels slightly lower here, though not dramatically so. These microvariations are a constant feature of Ice Age environments, shaping where life gathers and where it avoids. You think about how different this world is from a stable environment here. Nothing remains consistent for long. Even the most familiar place can change character over time, depending on wind, moisture, and seasonal timing. A lesser-known insight from paleoecological studies is that vegetation zones during this period could shift gradually across landscapes, creating moving boundaries between forest, steppe, and tundra that influenced migration routes for both humans and animals. You continue walking, and the land rises slightly again from this higher point, the view expands outward, revealing a broad and quiet expanse that feels both open and layered with invisible structure. The wind strengthens a little, moving across the grass in long, smooth currents. It creates a sense of motion that is not confined to any single direction, but spread across the entire landscape. And as you move deeper into this vast Ice Age world, you begin to understand that what appears to be emptiness is actually constant transformation. A living system of change that quietly shapes every path, every decision, and every moment of survival. You continue forward across the Ice Age steppe, where the land slowly begins to feel like it is preparing for another transition. The openness remains, but subtle changes in light and texture suggest that the environment is never fully settled for long. It is always in a state of becoming something else. A widely recognised conclusion in paleoclimate studies is that as the last Ice Age drew toward its end, global temperatures began to rise unevenly, triggering complex feedback loops between ice sheets, ocean currents, and atmospheric systems that reshaped ecosystems across the Northern Hemisphere. You walk through a stretch of ground where the grass grows slightly denser. The colour is still muted, but there is a faint sense of richness compared to earlier sections of your journey. Even small changes in vegetation feel significant in a world shaped by scarcity and adaptation. A lesser, in detail from sediment core analysis, is that pollen records show rapid shifts in plant communities during this period, with some species expanding quickly into newly available habitats, while others retreated or disappeared entirely. You pause briefly and look toward the horizon. The sky is calm, but not static. It carries a layered softness, as if multiple weather systems are overlapping at a distance too large to perceive clearly. In Ice Age environments, atmosphere is never simple. It is always structured in depth. Some researchers continue to explore how these environmental transitions influenced human migration patterns, suggesting that groups often moved not only in response to immediate survival needs, but also in anticipation of longer-term ecological shifts. You continue walking, and the wind feels slightly warmer now, though still cold by any modern standard. It is a subtle shift, but noticeable enough to change how the landscape feels against your skin. You pass through another shallow depression where frost still lingers in patches. The ground here holds on to cold longer than surrounding areas, creating small pockets of microclimate variation that influence vegetation and animal movement. A well-documented finding in archaeological research is that late Ice Age human groups often demonstrated remarkable flexibility in subsistence strategies, combining hunting, gathering, and opportunistic resource use depending on seasonal availability. You notice faint movement in the distance again. It is unclear whether it is animals or simply the distortion of heat and light over uneven terrain. In this world, perception is often uncertain, and certainty itself is a rare condition. You continue forward, and the landscape begins to open slightly more. The horizon feels less compressed now, as if the world is gently expanding again after a long period of constraint. A lesser-known observation from paleoenvironmental studies is that transitional phases between glacial and warmer periods often produced highly variable local conditions, with some regions warming rapidly, while others remained relatively stable. You think about how survival here depends not only on strength or endurance, but on timing, knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to change direction becomes more important than any single skill. The grass ripples again in long waves as the wind passes through. It is steady presence, shaping everything without force, only persistence. And as you move deeper into this shifting Ice Age world, you begin to sense that the great transformation described by scientists is not a single event in the future, but a slow unfolding already present in every breath of wind, every change in soil, and every fragile step across this ancient land, you continue forward across the open Ice Age landscape, where the final stretch of your journey feels both familiar and quietly different. The land is still vast and cold, but there's a subtle softness in the air, as if the world is loosening its long-held tension. Nothing announces change directly, yet everything suggests it is approaching. A widely supported conclusion in late Quaternary research is that the end of the Ice Age was not a single unified collapse of cold conditions, but a complex and uneven transition marked by regional warming, shifting precipitation patterns, and gradual reorganization of global ecosystems. You walk slowly now, noticing how the ground feels slightly less rigid beneath your steps. Frost still exists, but it is thinner in places, revealing darker soil beneath. This contrast creates a layered surface, as if two versions of the world are overlapping. A lesser-known detail from paleoecological records is that some regions show rapid expansion of shrubland and early forest growth during this transitional phase, indicating that vegetation responded quickly once temperature thresholds were crossed. You glance toward the horizon again. The sky is calm, with soft gradients of light that feel more open than before. It is not warmth in the modern sense, but a reduction in harshness, a quiet easing of environmental pressure. Some researchers continue to debate how directly these climatic changes influenced human population recovery, with interpretations ranging from slow, gradual adaptation to more dynamic periods of rapid expansion following environmental improvement. You continue walking, and the wind feels less sharp now. It still moves across the land, but its edges are softened. The grass responds with gentler motion, as if the entire landscape is entering a quieter phase of itself. You pass through a final stretch of uneven ground where traces of frost linger in small scattered patches. These remnants feel like memory more than presence, small echoes of a colder world slowly fading. A well-documented observation in archaeology is that post-Ice Age human groups expanded their territories significantly, adapting to new forests, rivers, and coastlines that emerged as ice sheets retreated. You think about everything you have seen on this journey: the shifting camps, the silent migrations, the fragile firelight, and the constant negotiation between survival and environment. Nothing here was stable, yet everything endured through adaptation. A lesser-known insight from interdisciplinary studies is that many environmental changes during this period occurred in pulses rather than smooth transitions, creating alternating phases of stress and opportunity for both humans and ecosystems. You continue forward, and the land begins to feel less constrained again. The horizon opens wider, and the sense of pressure that once lingered in the air now feels distant, as if the world has stepped back slightly from its own edge. And as you walk through this final stretch of the Ice Age world, you begin to understand that the forgotten disaster is not only a moment of loss, but also a long process of transformation, where collapse and renewal are intertwined in ways that shape the future of all human history. You come to a slow stop, standing in the quiet openness of a world that has already begun to change. The wind passes gently across the land, carrying no urgency, only movement, and in that stillness, you realize that the story of this ancient world never truly ended. It simply continued forward, becoming the ground beneath everything that exists today. Sweet dreams.